Welcome, everybody, to this interview with Karthik Suresh, who's very generously offered to help us out today. And we've also got Chris Mortimer as well in the interview, who's going to help me out with some questions. So thanks, Chris, for joining us. So I'm not going to introduce Karthik too much. I'm going to let him talk himself. So basically, the focus of the interview today is going to be around strategy. And in particular, thinking about how rich picturing can be useful in supporting strategy or the strategy making process. And Karthik has got a lot of experience at exploring that. So that's what we're going to be focusing on today. And he's going to actually give us a little bit of a demonstration as well on the whiteboard as to how that might work in practice. So thanks for joining us, Karthik. Perhaps we'll just let you say yourself a little bit about your career and your career development just to get us started.
Okay. Well, I'll do it using a visual right from the off. That's okay. So just check everything's working. Can you see that? Is that working all right?
Yep.
Perfect.
Yep.
So I saw quite a nice way of kind of introducing a person's timeline sometimes. So I'll just use that briefly to show you kind of how this might work. So we're going to start off and just look at things as a timeline. I was born in India, came from there, spent the first 17 years in India, and then I came to the UK to study in 2000. And I came to study engineering, electronic and electrical engineering. I did a 3-year degree at Sheffield Uni. And then in 2004-05, I started a PhD in computational methods with nanotechnology. I found that I'd had a fair amount of experience with systems and programming and so on. I had a stint at ARM Semiconductors for a bit, just to where I learned quite a lot of programming capability. And I started this PhD, but I found that what I was really interested in was business and how that worked. So I had the opportunity around this sort of time to work with a small startup, just a few people who were working in the energy space. And I started doing a bit of consultancy for them a few days a week. And then eventually I joined them on a full-time basis. And we grew from 3 of us to, over the next 10 or so years, to 2013, about 35 people. We built a few businesses along the way, in our core energy space initially, to do with energy trading, and then a few other technical businesses, again, all around the energy space. And eventually in 2013, we were acquired by a large American organization. And I took the opportunity after the acquisition to go back to school and do an MBA again at the University of Sheffield. So that was a year or so, and then back into the workforce 2015-16, where I used some tools of the MBA to, first of all, the MBA in particular I found was most useful in explaining and understanding this kind of work experience period that I had previously. But I went back in, used all the tools in the MBA to apply myself to this larger organization we were now in. And since, I'd say, 2017 onwards, I really started using rich picturing, which I've been exposed to in the MBA, specifically around problems of sustainability. And so where we get to now, in 2020, I've been applying subsystems, rich pictures, and so on, specifically in the area of sustainable development for companies, quite actively. So that's a rough timeline as to kind of my career so far. All the way through, I've pretty much been a blank sheet of paper sort of person. So starting with just a blank sheet, you can see, has been my role, develop capability and trying to figure out what we should do next with the business.
Okay, brilliant, and that's a really nice representation there. So, what sort of drew you into the rich picturing? What attracted you to that?
I think it started really when I had my first child. So he was born in 2011, 2013, 14, as I was kind of starting the MBA. We had our second kid, and he was about 3-4 years old. And I found that when you have a child who's kind of really upset and cannot be consoled, one way of dealing with the situation is to draw a picture. So we would draw things like, you shouldn't really have thrown that ice that was in the glass at your mum because that made her cross, sort of thing. And I found that you could actually engage a child who was really emotionally involved in the situation through a story. We call this thing drawing a story. And I found that simple approach of being able to deal with a 3 or 4-year-old through drawing meant you could explore a situation, you could put your emotions to one side, you could talk through a lot more with that child and work your way through to this is what that means, and you got choices. You can go this way or that way, and that's going to make you more unhappy, and that's going to make you happy. Which way do you want to go, for example? And I kind of realized that these tools, if they work with 3-year-olds, they're going to work with 30-year-olds. And so when I was doing the MBA, this drawing a story element, I started bringing this into the MBA because I started taking notes with sketch notes, which people probably come across before in other contexts. So I was introduced sketch notes about that time. I think Dan Rome's book came out, Back of Napkin. His book came out about the same time. So I had these kind of elements coming in. And then in the MBA, I was formally introduced to SSM. Well, I wasn't introduced during the MBA. It was more of a chance remark by one of the professors. And all these bits kind of came together to kind of go, this is actually quite interesting. It's different. It's a way to explore situations, in a completely different way to the traditional strategy process I've been doing in the last 10, 15 years.
Okay, and did you sort of straight away see it as being a tool that you could use, in a project, or was it sort of something that you saw more in your private life?
It was very it took time to see the value of this method. So, it started off as very much private life thing. And then with sketch notes, it was, okay, you've got a lecturer, stood there talking on a board for 3 hours quite often in an MBA lecture. And my entire, I think there was a timing element. So when I did the MBA, there's a bit of a joke about Indian students, we all become doctors, lawyers, engineers. Your parents think you have a choice because you can choose what kind of doctor, lawyer, engineer you become. So my first degree, all of this stuff around here was done almost to meet expectations. You had to do these kinds of things. And I liked it and I enjoyed it, but I didn't particularly, if I was left myself, I'd become a writer or spend more time drawing early on in my career. So I saw the MBA as a chance to almost kind of reflect and say, I've done all this stuff because I'm expected to do it. But now I want to follow something because I'm actually interested in that. And I want to follow something because I think there's intrinsic interest in doing it. So with a typical kind of lecture, you think about, well, what's my objective here? It's probably pass an exam and get scores and do all that sort of thing. Well, with the MBA, I had a different objective. It was actually to learn. And I wanted to use these tools to really think about learning. And you could compress a 3-hour lecture into a single page with, concepts and pictures and diagrams. I can realize there's a certain power to being able to do that within that context. You could take knowledge that was in somebody's head that they were trying to express to you and see the pattern behind that. And that was one way of doing it. But obviously, when you go into real life, the patterns don't exist. It's much more complicated. And so one of the transitions I had to kind of make was I realized that you go from recording something that exists to teasing out something that isn't articulated. And that realization took a while because I went from sketch notes, we had all these concepts in place, realizing actually, when you draw a sketch note or you draw an artifact like that, it's almost like a piece of art. It looks really pretty, but how is it useful? Useful components are actually sometimes smaller. It's a single thing that expresses a particular idea. And so what you then have to do is figure out how to go and talk to people who have these really complex pictures in their heads and draw out all these ideas and see the models that actually hide among those ideas. And this transition piece probably took me about 2 or 3 years to realize as I kind of kept practicing and drawing and writing. In 2017, what I actually did was start a blog, which I think you're sharing with the students. And it was through the practice of keeping the blog that some of these things became more obvious to me. It certainly wasn't obvious in the beginning that this is how I was going to use this in practice.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting. I mean, I certainly in my practice, whether I'm doing strategy projects or whether I'm doing sort of straight sort of soft systems methodology type projects or any project really, I tend to think of a rich picture as being a way of sort of helping me to start to come to terms with the complexity of the situation that I'm facing, and certainly that was something that I always found to be a real challenge at the beginning of any sort of project, and especially when I was working in commercial consultancy, where the speed with which you can get your head around a new situation was really, really important because you were always under significant time pressure because of the nature of consultancy. So for me, it was really a way of, I still tend to think of it as being, how can I understand this situation? But I think you've gone a step further in the sense that you try and link your picture to activities that might happen in the future, and actually try and use the rich picturing as a way of sort of teasing out future projects or future activities. I mean, am I right in saying that?
I think so. I mean, I started with the term rich picture initially because, it was what I was introduced to. And it was actually after I met you, Giles, that I kind of realized that perhaps what I was doing wasn't perhaps best captured by that term, because there are two different elements to it. I think if you have something where there is a pattern of some kind, you can say, there are these components and they sort of fit in this way, and you have these relationships and these people, and you're kind of working your way through that sort of thing. Then you end up with something which is more akin to a rich picture sort of approach. And then you have something where the individuals are talking through a process, and as they kind of talk about stuff, these things emerge. They're not kind of there really. They might not be aware these systems exist, but they start to come out through the conversation. And that was more akin to the conceptual maps sort of thing that you talked about. And I guess in terms of where this work that I've been doing has gone, I'm sort of in the space between these two, where you enter situations. So, for example, with sustainable transformation work in the area of carbon, nobody knows how to do this properly. We're still trying to figure out what actually needs to happen to help an organization transition from being an existing, carbon-intensive operation to being something that's low carbon. So you have to almost work your way through the thinking. And as you do more and more of these, then patterns do emerge. But I think there is a balance to be struck in saying, look, this is your reality, and asking, well, what does your reality look like from your point of view? So even if, as a consultant, you know the answers, it's important to take people through this process of thinking it out for themselves, but only then are they ready to listen to your brilliant suggestions about how to change things. They have to kind of see the situation themselves. So I found there's kind of an art to how you have these conversations so that you're all looking roughly at the same kind of picture. And that's where some of the tools like going from rich pictures to actual models or holons, that sort of approach, I think is documented in the literature, but I have quite a structured way of saying, okay, here's what you told me, here are the models that seem to be emerging from that, do you agree with that? And therefore these models lead to a certain set of actions. And so what you're doing almost is developing opportunity. I mean, none of this stuff is done just for the sake of having a chat. It's usually done because you are trying to have some kind of transformation that improves a situation for the people involved, and that you have to do through action. So these things start to get linked together. And I find that the existing theory does describe it quite well, but you probably hit the point previously, when we talked about speed. The biggest issue with most methods, I suspect, is that they're just not quick enough to deal with this complexity. But and my work has been around maybe using technology in a way that helps to accelerate that process, going from thought to models to action and being able to loop around faster.
Okay, great. So jump in, Chris, if you want to ask any questions.
Yeah. I mean, really, really fascinating stuff, and I'm interested, Karthik, in how does it work in a practical sense. So obviously today you've just broken out the whiteboard, and it's so powerful seeing you visualize what you're saying in that way. So would you run a client's engagement like this? Would you always have some kind of visualization going on?
Increasingly so. So I think what I've kind of come to as a method to some extent is to say, okay, and it's really worth kind of taking a little bit of a step back again, just with those kind of various approaches that I had over time. If I take you back very quickly to this timing here, where I talked about a period where I think I was looking very technical approaches to solving problems. Then to a period here where I was thinking more in terms of sales and explaining how that works in a second. And then this period post the MBA and, as I mentioned, SSM, which I think was a more softer approach. So one model that I found very useful to think about this was this idea of systems models. So typically, if you are somebody who is a technical person, you think in terms of solutions. And so your solutions might be simple or they might be complex. At the end of it, you kind of say, if we do it this way, it'll work. And this has worked for a large part of my career. I go in, and again, you deal with Chris from the Excel point of view. You go in, you understand the problem, you can build an Excel model, it'll solve your issue. There you go. Mm-hmm. But then what tends to happen is you get these situations where if it's everybody agrees with you and everybody likes what you're doing, then it's easy. You kind of go ahead and just do the idea. There's no kind of question about it. You just do it. More often in real life, you kind of get the situation where there's lots of conflict. People don't actually like each other that much. There's lots of politics going on. And in that situation, no technical solution will change that. I think you actually need to go in and do some, you might need to change people first. And then there's a bit in the middle where some people like what you're doing, some people dislike what you're doing, some people are neutral to the whole issue. And most real life projects fall into this space. And then what that means is you're saying, well, people actually have brains, and what they are trying to do is work with some kind of purpose. So in order to kind of do something in terms of solution in this space, what you have to do is understand people's purpose, and then you can actually build something that is fit for purpose. And what I found quite nice is this actually chimes with the language of quality. So quality, the most recent definitions are building something that is fit for purpose rather than fit for kind of need or whatever else. And the whole way of understanding purpose requires you to recognize these individuals are part of the process. So you can't just take a solution you have and put it into this thing and say it'll work in every single situation, because the people are always going to be different in every single situation. Mm-hmm. So my starting point there is saying, okay, well, what that means is with any engagement, what you have to do is first of all get a few individuals in place and get them to talk you through how they see the world. And it's impossible to...
Can I stop you there, Karthik? Like that, yeah. That specifically is what I'm interested in, so obviously I'm a consultant myself. I know Giles has done a lot of projects over the years as well, but yeah. When you're approaching a prospective customer and you're saying, our first workshop is going to be about how you see the world, how do you manage kind of the salesmanship around that, and how do you make the client buy into that and not just see it as kind of a cheesy management workshop?
Yeah, I think one of the things there is, what are the alternatives? So the alternative of doing this, which is what I was doing, in my kind of sales phase. So if you look at this phase here, and I was trying this approach, the alternative of doing this is perhaps going down something that you would see with McKinsey route. So having a PowerPoint deck that sets out your argument. Mm. And what you're trying to do in this situation is persuade. You're trying to create this flow of arguments, with titles and nice pictures. So this is what you should do. And that's your typical kind of picture of a consultant. You come in there and you do this activity. You persuade people into doing.
And you definitely wear a tie as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think this situation emerged from a different approach. So professionally, I was doing this because I thought that was the right thing to do.
Yep.
But I was also getting a lot more comfortable with the idea. So again, 15, 20 years back, I went to a marketing kind of session run by one of our suppliers. And they said, look, if you're trying to talk to somebody, rather than pulling out a presentation, just, talk at a whiteboard. Just get something up, with a pen, and you'll find that people are surprisingly engaged when you talk them through this using a whiteboard. So like right now, for example, we're doing this session. I could have a presentation, I could have a website, I could pull out a brochure, I could do all that sort of stuff. But I haven't really, to some extent, given anybody a choice. I've jumped straight into it. This is the tool I'm using. I'm going to talk through using a whiteboard. And I think it takes a certain amount of comfort doing that. If somebody's going to talk to you the very first time, you're like, quite often I'll just start off and say, well, here's my board, here's a smiley picture. Let's start with that. Yeah. They see that. There's a bit of cognitive dissonance in the sense that they're like, that's what they're expecting. They're expecting to see a PowerPoint with, your company name and a title. That's what they're expecting to see. But you don't give them that choice. You just start straight with this. Okay. You set expectations that it's going to be an informal sort of thing. Yeah. And you find that very quickly people get over that initial sense of shock, and they get engaged with the process. throughout this process, I'd ask you guys, have you been thinking, actually, this is really an unprofessional way of doing things, or this is something that isn't engaging me?
Oh, me? Well, personally, obviously, you're preaching to the converted to some extent, because personally, I love this kind of thing. But I have experienced many times in my career, and I think Giles would agree, where I want to take this kind of approach, but I'm worried about how a client is gonna take it. It is going to interpret it and receive it, and perhaps they're thinking, "Hang on, I'm paying this guy for some nice PowerPoint presentations. I'm paying for them to turn up in a suit and tie, and that's what I'm expecting."
Yeah.
So, but I think, I've got a lot out of what you said there. Sometimes you've got to just take a leap of faith, and if you do it with enough confidence and conviction, and say, "This is how we're doing it," I suppose that the client will definitely buy into it. One thing I've taken out of what you're doing, Karthik, is, and I know it's a reservation that a lot of people have about rich picturing and visualizations generally, is they think they have to be artistic. To do a rich picture, it has to look beautiful. But you're saying, just through your quite simplistic representations here, it's very powerful. I think anybody really could open up Microsoft Whiteboard and have a go at doing what Karthik's doing now.
I think exactly the point. The technology here, the way I see this is you tend to go in a few directions, and that's what presentations do as well. Again, some of the stuff is in the literature, but if you think about your rich picture as an object, I think you have to decide whether it's art or whether it's something which is a temporary thing that helps you make meaning. If you go on the art route, then you go down, we need presentations, and we need to have really nice sketch notes, really pretty stuff that become artifacts in themselves. And then you put them on a wall somewhere and you ignore them for all time. How many presentations do you really go back to and use actively all the time? Well, the point about, for me, these pictures is that they are a temporary thing that helps people kind of go, "Ooh, that's what I'm thinking, and that's what I need to do next."
It's a means to an end. It's not the end itself.
Precisely. And that's why and it takes some time. It takes time getting comfortable with the fact that, when you look at this picture, it is messy. There is no kind of, structure to it necessarily. And I'm not trying to be arty and put loads of, shading and stuff into it. And again, you'll see that on my blog as I experiment with different ways of doing things. I've come to the conclusion that what I'm trying to do is get stuff down quickly. And, words are important because, you can write the word model much faster. You can draw the concept of a model. So one of the things that perhaps is important to recognize is, because this is a temporary thing, what you're trying to do, what's the purpose of your presentation? The purpose of your presentation eventually, for a business anyway, is to get to the point where you can put something in front of a client that is a proposal they can sign. You're going to end up with a bunch of words and a space for signature. Whether you get there through a presentation route, whether you get there through this rich picturing, this is still the output. This is the end result. The picture has no real value in itself. So I think the way I see this is, these processes basically unlock opportunity, and you see them not as things in themselves that have value necessarily, but they have value in the sense of how much value do they unlock. And then when you've proven you unlock value, you can then figure out how to share that value among the participants.
I think that makes total sense to me. I think the slight tension in people's minds and thinking about the students who are going to watch this is, okay, a picture, that's something I've got to, spend time over. And, as you said, it's going to go on the wall. It's going to be kind of a finished thing in itself. But we're talking about rich picturing as just being a medium, aren't we? Like a vehicle to facilitate the conversation. So the quality of the picture really doesn't matter.
All that matters is that the participants are getting meaning out of it, and they are seeing what they have. Because very often, and I find that this happens, as I talk to people. So, for example, I had a situation where I was talking to a group of people, and one person was quite dominant, and so their stream of thought, ended up on the whiteboard being something that looked a bit like this. There was this long stream of thought that they came out with. Yeah. And so another person came out and said, "Well, actually, I don't think this is going to work for us as a method." So in terms of they're critiquing the method itself. Now, typically what you would do is you kind of go get a bit defensive. You'd say, "Well, hang on a second, this does work." But instead, what I did in that situation, not really consciously, but just what happened was, because as they were talking, I started recording what they were doing, and recorded essentially another stream with their thoughts about how this wouldn't work. which then led to this person saying, well, actually, it could work if we made these changes. And the accommodation starts to emerge from the interaction, the conversation, from the individuals themselves. So as a consultant, what you're doing is facilitating them thinking through their own, internal conflict, I suppose, and figuring out accommodation and compromise that will work for them, which then obviously means you can, if you can then say, given all this, here's where I can help you, that's your proposal structure.
So I know that's a common critique of rich picturing and SSM more generally, is that one person can dominate the process. So there you're saying, I'm thinking about people early in their career, trying to kind of stand up to a senior manager can be a difficult thing to do. So to be able to have this external construct to reference and draw the sting from the situation a bit, that sounds like a really useful thing.
Well, I find that also, if you think about what the consultant is doing, we have a typical situation where a consultant has to come in and feels a bit like they have to prove their value to the thing.
Oh, totally.
So you're going to have, the client has a situation, and this is something I had to get more comfortable with. They start talking about this particular thing, and you go, you know what, I can solve that already, and you feel like you have to jump in with that contribution. I find that even if you know the answer, you have to put your answer in a little sort of box over here and firewall it, and let them carry on talking through things until they realize, they go, actually, we need something that looks like this. And then you go, I have one of these things over here, and then you bring it in. So part of the skill, I think, is, and it goes back to kind of the point you made previously, where's the barrier to entry to this whole process? The technology is not the barrier to entry. It's not, anybody can start drawing and doing this stuff. It's your individual skill as a consultant, and the barrier comes down to, do you have enough experience to know when to talk and when to keep quiet? And most of the time, you should keep quiet because it forces the client to carry on articulating their own thoughts around this stuff. But it does take some time to get comfortable doing that and just writing and drawing.
Absolutely. And I think, I've taught SSM like hundreds of times now, and trying to persuade the student. I think the culture in kind of educational culture in universities is we're trying to train students to go in and be problem solvers. And that's what students think it's all about, and if you look at the promotional material in any business school, brochure, it's all PowerPoint presentations and problem solving. So to achieve that shift in mindset and say, no, actually, your work is going to be so much more powerful if you can sit back and facilitate, and your client is going to love you forever. It's very difficult to achieve that change in mindset with students, I find.
And I appreciate that, because it took me time. It took me years of doing things with the presentation structure, and I spent, and I can look back at the presentations I had, and I read everything about McKinsey, because they have some really good examples of this. And you find that the presentations have a place, and I don't think we should kind of, but that place effectively is saying, look, here's an argument, here's a thread that logically follows, and if I follow this thread, I'll address all of your objections, and so this is something that you should really consider doing. But quite often this again starts with the point of you know the shape and size of the problem, and you know what good looks like. If you don't know the problem, or if you don't know what good looks like, and you really have a fuzzy real world situation like, well, what should I do about this at all? That's when this structure starts to falter, because you can't use data and analysis to explain something that you actually don't really know in the first place. So I think there's a step where you kind of go, we have to also have a space to talk about purpose in a structured way. And I think this came across quite nicely when you think about the language of objectives and targets and all that sort of stuff. In most businesses, what people do is they kind of fire their arrows, and then they draw the bullseye around where they've hit. That's the general principle of how you do things. And I think part of this point here is saying, actually, this is roughly the direction we want to go in. And so then let's set some targets around that, and then let's talk reasonably about how we can get there. And that does require do some data analysis to justify this. But I feel like this process of, and this is almost never done in business. I don't see it happening very often, but I don't see it happening at all, really. But I found that being able to do this bit has meant that My clients are much happier about their strategy, the direction they're going in. The actions we're proposing, the model we're proposing is something they can buy into. And the actual plans of action and the presentations that fall out of this stuff are much more consistent. And the project delivery and stuff much more consistent. So traditional tools don't go away. They're all part of the process. It's just that this first step means that it's much clearer which direction you're heading in the first place.
Sure. As I said, it makes total sense to me. Like what I struggle with, I'm repeating myself a bit, but how do you frame that first session? Do you say this is a purpose session, this is a strategy session, this is a sense-making session? And how do you make it sound compelling enough for managers to come and emotionally buy into it?
I suppose, there is a little bit here about proof points. So when I first did this, actively back in 2018, I had a specific example. There was a client who was talking about this space, and again, because I was in this carbon space, they were like, we know we have lots to do, but we're not quite sure what to do about this space. And so one of my colleagues kind of spoke to me and said, do you have any ideas around this stuff? Because blank sheet paper stuff is my space. And I went, well, okay, I haven't got an answer right now in terms of here's a presentation, let's talk through what we're going to do. But what I can do is offer to run one of these sessions for you.
Yeah.
And I offered that as a session, and then I had a couple of people on that, and I found that as I went through the discussions and just used what is actually closer to a concept mapping exercise, the methodology started to emerge. Now, I had actually constructed the methodology back in the do my MBA days, so dusting off something that I more or less had in place, but I hadn't used Anchor in a commercial sense that much. And this ended up with kind of creating this model of kind of objectives and activities. And that first one ended up with this individual who did it, trying it for a while, and then coming back and saying, that was a really useful session. I used that for 6 months. Can I run another one? Which then said, this is actually what you need to do first. That's the first project. That then led into a proposal for a project. That then led into some money.
Mm-hmm.
And that was my first proof point a few years back about this methodology actually does lead to real projects and real money. But once I had that proof point, it was much easier to say, next client, this works. If you're looking at a similar situation, this methodology worked for this really big name, so the name you recognize immediately. So I kind of had a big brand who had gone through this process. And then now I have several more brands who've gone through the process. And in a sales position, I can say to you, I've done a few hundred of these with some of these really big names, and you'll recognize them, and this works. So, it's not a waste of your time. Effectively, I'm going to spend the time where I will be selling to you, running a session like this that actually will help you. And at the end of it, and I suppose that one of the points about the methodology here is I've refined it to the point where I know that I need 2 90-minute sessions. In the first session, we'll actually start to see the shape and size of the problem. Because typically a consultant will go and say, your problem, I've solved lots of problems that look like boxes. And that's what I've got in here. I've got a toolkit in this presentation that will build this box for you. And one of the terms that I found was quite interesting was this concept of requisite variety, which I probably don't interpret the right way. But for me, in very simple terms, it is that real life problems aren't like boxes. They're more like these amoeba-shaped type things. And so you need to have the ability to kind of deal with all of these things with a variety of situations. And the only way you can deal with a variety of situations is by understanding the full variety of what you're trying to get into. Now, just tangentially,
medium to understand it, and PowerPoint doesn't have the requisite variety to
precisely.
It. Yeah.
Now, one slight tangent here was there's something else I realized, because I think there is something around product versus service approaches. So most of us are trained in a product kind of mentality, where what we're trying to do is, you want to make a cup, we want the same cup again and again. And we're thinking, if we can just make a product, then we can kind of do this, and it'll always be more or less the same. But as you can see, even my cups are rubbish there. But the objective with products, and that leads to also lean thinking and those sort of approaches, is what you want to do is reduce variation. You're trying to kind of push down variation and keep things within these tolerances. And I came across the work of John Seddon, who I think talked about services as a way of coping with variety. I think that was a really useful definition. If you want to build a product, yes, you want to reduce variation. If you want to build a service, what you want to do is cope with the variety. Because every client and all these people are different, and their objectives are different, their purpose is different.
Yeah.
So then you kind of if you see these two things being different, I think a big mistake I certainly made early in my career was trying to address process and product-based approaches to a service development problem. And that's why I was trying to apply a box to the variety. It just didn't work.
So here you're talking about when you phone up your bank and, you know, you go through all the automated stuff, you know, you feel it's dehumanizing, isn't it? That's because you're being treated a bit like a product, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, each one is kind of different, but obviously, you know, a bank is trying to avoid you talking to a real person who can sort the thing out because they think that's what cost is. But you have to, I mean, I think there's all these things link into other stages. So as consultants, there's another thing about sales theory which suggests that you have two kinds of two axes to think about. You've either got stuff that's transactional that you can do on a computer, or the stuff that is kind of individual you need to do with a person. And you've got low cost and high cost stuff. And the world used to be, if you spent a bit more money, you know, you would get a bit more service. And if you went to a showroom, you'd get an expensive car, you would get a better class salesperson in a suit who help you kind of decide what's going on. Well, now the reality is the world is kind of transactional or consultative. Either people know exactly what they want, you know, whether it's a yacht or whether it's kind of a new computer, and they'll go onto eBay and just buy it, and it's transactional. Or they'll come onto YouTube and look for something that's transactional kind of conversation. Or they really don't know what they want, and it is a complex, you know, situation full of variety where they need your help working it out. I think consultancy approach like SSM work quite nicely in this space. They're not designed necessarily for transactional stuff unless you're trying to figure out how to build a transactional thing in the first place.
Yes.
So you're thinking here about how to build something here. So anyway, going to go by the sessions themselves, I found that there was two things. The two sessions, the first one really was understanding variety. And then the second session was, okay, so what do we do about it? And that's why I kind of saw these things, or what's emerged for me is that these SSM sessions are not necessarily things in themselves that are chargeable. What they do is they unlock a kind of pot of value, and then you can say, I can help you with these bits, and that's what it's going to cost. In certain cases, I find that what it does unlock is a realization that variety is so much, and there's so many stakeholders who haven't been included, that maybe you need to run more of these sessions with them. But now they've seen how it works, they will then go, well, you know, I'd like to commission a few more of these sessions. Can you run these for a few more people? Then you get buy-in from them into the process.
You said you typically do two 90-minute sessions?
That's right, yeah. I find I need that much typically because the first hour is almost people exhausting themselves. It's their turn to talk, and I have to keep them, you know, talking through their situation until the variety has been exposed. And then when they've talked it through and everything's happening and they're repeating themselves, and you can see they're repeating themselves because it's kind of in the model, you know. You talk about that at this point. You don't need to go through that again. Then it's the stage where you can come in and say, it looks like, you know, is this right? Is this first of all, is this model summarizing what you're trying to do? Okay, now we're exhausted. We can see a shape and size of the problem, the complexity of what you're facing. In the second session, let's come back and just talk about, okay, what this means, and let's talk about the model itself and what we can do to improve your situation.
Can I just ask a quick question about this? Because this is right where I want to sort of press a bit. Yeah. So the first thing is, how many people are in this session? You know, how many people can you cope with?
I tend to, again, recommend that it's one or two in the first session. So you tend to do it in a phased approach. If you run this with 10, 15 people, when I have run with larger sessions, it does get dominated by one or two people. So what you want to do is almost educate your counterpart in the organization about the value of keeping quiet. But to do that, you first get them to talk, and then see the power of the process. So I think it's one of those things where you have a transition as you go through the process. You'll start off with a couple of individuals, you know, usually quite often just one, and we'll talk to them and kind of work through the situation with them. Then what it ends up with is you get a model coming out of this that says this is what we need to do next. Now that person will have to go off to, you know, a decision-making body of a board or something else to authorize the work that's involved. And it might be that's enough. That's all you need to do is then go ahead and have a working relationship with just those individuals. But in some cases, you end up with a situation that says, you know what we have. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to say that you talk about models. I think we just need to be a little bit careful with our terminology here. So I think certainly the traditional view of a rich picture is that it describes the current situation that the business or the individual or the people are in. So it's a description of a current situation, and certainly when I'm running this sort of session, what I'm trying to do is to get them to express that situation and identify issues. So I just say, just describe the situation to me, identify the issues, and then we'll stop, and then we'll go away and we'll think about it. Whereas I think you have a different strategy, which is really trying to link into ideas for action. And I'd just like to try and draw that out of you a little bit more. So when you talk about models, are you talking about, action models to, which could be potential projects, or are you talking about your rich picture?
So I think the picture is a thing in itself. So picture stroke concept map is one element. So RP concept map is this thing over here.
Yeah.
Now, what I found was as I kind of, so just like you're saying, the first point is describe the situation to me. And I think the current situation is something which is being brought out in here. The one slight sophistication is that it happens to be one person's perspective on that situation. It doesn't necessarily, capture the physical situation as it exists in my sense. I take it as this is how you see the world, and you see your position in that. Now, what happens there is if I use just the categorical approach as a rule of thumb, you end up with, okay, what are you trying to do in terms of the customers and the owners, the individual involved? What are the things you have in place already? What are the issues? What's kind of missing, that you might need? And we just, I let the discussion kind of just flow through in terms of, I need you to tell me what's in your head. Now, what happens as you go through the conversation, I find, is that things start to group themselves into various logical points. You might have, 200 points coming out in this session. And one of the purpose of this session is actually to elicit purpose. And I think when you think about what Techland's written about appreciative systems, quite often what we're trying to say is, how do we capture all this complexity in a way that appreciates this person's point of view? And that's the whole-on kind of model. So I tend to use, essentially, these things can be expressed in a way that looks very much like the whole-ons that Techland has. So that's specifically what I call a model, which says, appreciate this person's point of view, appreciate they have these constraints on them, explore the idea that you want to do X, Y, or Z, and using that kind of terminology and language. I think again you for first met you, Giles, about how it's almost like a modeling language. I think using the modeling language idea to translate this rich picture from the words of the client into something which is the words of a modeling language, which you could then check with the client reflects their own position here. But you go from these 200 things to your 5 plus or minus 2 sentences that summarize what purpose looks like for them.
So Karthik, you don't see a distinction between the problem structuring phase, which is rich picturing, and the conceptual modeling phase, which might come a bit later. You'll kind of view those two as more fluid and interchangeable?
I think that the difference for me was driven a bit by the technology, because what happened was I have this modeling phase, right? And typically in the literature you can go off and then spend some time in the room and come back and say, here are a bunch of models. What I found was you could simply put a layer on top of this existing one and draw the model on top of it.
Okay. And
a model emerged from that first conversation. So you had this kind of direct tie-in from this to this.
Yeah.
And that was one of the first, I think, it's like innovations almost in this approach, where typically you would have, I suppose, again, from literature, you could have many of these models and say these models describe things from several points of view. While, and in one of Techland's books, you actually have an example of him having the same experience, where the process of writing and kind of documenting what was being told helped the model, the conceptual model, to emerge from that. So I think it's a little bit closer just because of the technology and the approach that I take, which lets me put layers on top of things.
Okay. So when you're building those models, it's more a kind of a practical thing of mapping the model onto the situation rather than a technical thing of going cat woe and having a very technically sound model.
Yes, I think it's again it comes down to speed. So I use the catchboard thing, as a checklist. I also add some of the consultant things about timelines and those sorts of elements. But in general, I think I do want to go from this rich picture is not an end in itself. I do always want to go from this to, okay, did this model summarize what things look like from your point of view? Because what I can then do is I can go and test this model with another participant and say, and quite often you find that you can put this model down and then build another rich picture on top of this, which interrogates the model itself, and you end up with a whole bunch of other notes and things that then can create a different model. So again, rather than being I've got this, I now have this. You might well have I have this. Let's now do a rich picture on this model, which then creates a bit more certainty around it.
Okay, I'm really interested in this, and I'd like to go further with this, but I don't think this video is the place to do it, unfortunately, because we're gonna go too long. So I'm just going to pull you back a little bit, because I'd like to perhaps maybe we can sort of do this in another video. That process that you're talking about, I think it's really interesting. Just a few practical points, before we end this particular video. Is what you're describing obviously a process of talking to people about how they see the situation? Have you found a particular way of delivering that works best? So obviously, I know we're all sort of locked down at the moment, so we're all kind of having to do it online and remotely. But it sounds like you could do this. Is that actually your favorite way of doing it, Karthik, or do you actually like to get in the room with people and get on a whiteboard?
Personally, I prefer this because I think what you have on screen in front of you now with the Microsoft Whiteboard is this infinite screen. I had that with my Linux-based toolkit a few years back. This has started to come out now within the Microsoft environment. But as you can see, this infinite screen is just incredibly useful because you can go into the detail of a particular conversation, and people can, you also limit the complexity, the cognitive complexity, and focus on that space. But then you also have, I find personally, that the simple fact that you have this geographical information in your head means you can go back and say, oh, you talked about it at that point in that space, and you can move around and get to that. And obviously you don't need to travel, you can kind of jump onto a call now and start your session. There's no preparation, there's no whiteboard stuff involved. You just kind of jump on a call and you start going. So again, for me, what's really important is speed all the way through. I think speed is a superpower, especially for a small company or anybody who's trying to sell anything. The faster you can do it, and the less friction there is. If you don't need to say to somebody, I will have to explain this to you. You just kind of go, let's jump on a call and let's just do it.
Yeah.
Your mouse pad there. Sorry, Giles. Are you just using a mouse to do that, Karthik, or do you have a stylus or something?
Just check my camera again. So I have a little thing that looks a bit like this. This is a Trust tablet. It's a flexible graphics tablet that works fine with Windows. And then there's a little pen. So I'm just doing with these two. Again, the barrier to entry for this stuff from a technology and a cost point of view is negligible. It's 40 quid for this tablet. But if you haven't used a tablet before, it does take some time to train your eye because your hand is working in one place, your eyes looking somewhere else. And I've been, one of the things that I do is I try and write every day and I try and draw every day. So after 6 years of practice, you can still see it's a bit rubbish. It is, yeah. But also, so I've been comfortable with the mess. What you're seeing here is not art, but hopefully, as viewers also watch it, they will hopefully have kind of the visuals will have helped to understand these concepts. If I just describe what I was doing without these visuals, I think it'd be much harder for people to appreciate what's going on.
100%, yeah.
How do you think the participants in these sessions sort of relate to the finished picture? Obviously, Chris and I have sat in on this session and we've experienced it a bit like a client would experience it. Obviously, I'm looking at this rich picture now. Would you, if we were then going to finish the session and go away, would you sort of send this picture to me as a client and say, look, this is what we did? Or would you try and write this up and say, look, this is what was in the picture, and sort of show, help the client interpret the picture? Or would you just sort of brush it to one side and just say, well, we can forget that, we did it and this is what came out of it? Do you think clients really need to understand the picture?
Not necessarily. So what I tend to do, from a client's point of view, they already know this stuff. All that I've done is visualize what they already know. And maybe in doing that, I've helped them clarify what was in their heads in a certain way. So, and again, I'll do this here, but it's something which typically I would prefer to do on layers, because it kind of spoils my image a little bit. But if I just kind of take a step back and say, okay, what do we talk about so far? We'll talk about kind of my history up here, for example. We discussed stuff around, the sales process maybe here. How do we actually kind of go about selling this thing? We talked specifically about the rich picturing process here. And you said we'll come back to more detail later on. And perhaps over here we talked about the alternatives to what we were doing. Now, and what we do here, the thing I brought out here was in terms of kind of speed and approaches, and I think it's really important. So what this guy says is, look, how did I come to it? How do I use it in sales? Specifically, how does it work? What else could you do? And what's most important is speed. So you can see a model emerging from that in terms of how we would summarize the conversation. It's perfect. We have to have a discussion around it potentially, but even for that kind of short conversation, you can see that you could chunk this up in a way that says, if we would take something away from this, it is, I didn't develop overnight. It came from years of experience, reflection, practice, and coming to it from a variety of places. I found it useful specifically for sales and developing business opportunities, but there is a process you follow that I think comes out about 2 90-minute sessions that I do in a particular way that kind of works for me. Yes, you can do presentations, but I think the presentations and the analysis stuff come in a little bit further in the process, and they are important, but they're best when you are entering into persuasive mode and saying, here's the right thing to do, as opposed to the exploratory mode of what is the right thing to do. And the single thing you can do to make this more effective for you is to do it fast. If it takes you 2 weeks to go off and turn this around, then actually that's much less powerful. In my process, I can have a conversation, and then 10 minutes later, the client has their deck with these models built out, because it's programmatic. I've used some of those tools. Does that make sense as a kind of approach?
Yeah, it sounds like it's primarily oriented towards the sort of initial stages of a relationship with a client, and in the sort of creation of ideas for future projects. So it's kind of part of the problem structuring and sales process, if you like, and project design. Would you sort of also use this technique for other types of projects? So for the actual projects themselves as well.
Yes, I do all the time in a variety of stages. I do it whenever it's not clear to the participants what needs to happen.
Yeah.
So, for example, my first discussion may set the broad architecture. This is what we're trying to head towards. And so if the client is engaged here, I might need to do another client session at some point when we get the point where actually, what do we do next? So the client engagement. In the middle, I might run a number of sessions with my teams to say, look, I want you to do this kind of thing. Or what this means is, because you weren't necessarily in these first sessions, what we're trying to do for the client is these elements. Now go off and kind of do your build activity. So I find that there's almost kind of a two-track element to this. There is the doing and the building and the technology, again, because a lot of what we do is building a technology stack of one kind. And there is the thinking and the kind of thinking through, really, the problem. So I'll bring this in whenever there is a need to think through a situation with somebody, because then they have much more clarity on what we're trying to do, and they can go off and do the thing with a very clear vision, I suppose, of what we're all trying to achieve.
Okay, good. Right, brilliant. So have you got any last questions, Chris, I'm just conscious of time. Try and keep the video less than an hour.
No, I haven't actually. I got all mine in and just yeah, very interesting to hear how it's all working. So thank you. Yeah, really enjoyed it.
You're welcome.
Okay, brilliant. Have you got any final remarks that you'd like to make, Karthik, or shall we leave it there?
I think it's just that you know there is in this space. I find that you have a lot of competing methodologies and approaches, and obviously camps of people. So if you go down, say, the visual thinking route, there's very much focus on the art and making it look nice and the characters, and, and bubbles and stuff like that. And I think that maybe if you try and go down the track of let's make this art, you lose the benefit of it being a transitionary sense-making tool. And at the end of all of this picture, as you can see, is messy. It's not the end result. What needs to happen is this needs to go into a proposal or a document or a presentation or something which actually is useful to somebody that they can socialize within their organization. So one thing actually that we haven't touched on here was as you get to the point where you start to make more and more sense, and the key participants start to say, get their heads around, this is what we need to do, then it goes from being less about sense making and more about persuasion. And that's really where the presentation tools come in, and being able to write the proposal, construct a presentation that takes you through, handles objections. All those traditional skills are still very important, and students shouldn't forget them. It's just that they can supercharge the outcome of those capabilities by using the sense-making approach strategically at various points, in their engagements.
Brilliant. Well, thanks a lot, Karthik, and thanks a lot, Chris, for this really interesting interview. Obviously, we could talk more about this, but it's really fascinating to see how you're using rich pictures, and I'm keen to sort of have a go at this approach myself. Thanks a lot.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me on.